Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited about because I'm going to be chatting through some popular books that I think are worth the hype. Books you see everywhere, are curious about, have definitely heard of either on YouTube, maybe Book Talk or Instagram, but you might be wondering, is it just popular and everyone's reading it, or is it actually a good book? Well, I'm here today to let you know, based on my own opinion, so this is definitely subjective, if these popular books are in fact worth picking up and reading. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I'm going to be chatting about is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This is a book I only just recently read. This book felt like it was everywhere last year. It felt like everyone on the internet, it felt like everyone in my real life was picking this book up and reading it. I was super excited when it initially came out because I actually really love Gabrielle Zevin's writing, particularly her book, The Storied Life of A.J. Fickery, which just always been one of my favorite heartwarming reads. That being said though, as this book got more and more popular, it almost became more and more intimidating to pick up on my shelf. But I did finally read it, and you know what guys, it was absolutely fantastic. I loved every single second of it, even with incredibly high expectations that I had going into this. It still delivered. I felt like this book had the perfect balance of incredibly interesting characters, very dynamic relationships, and just in general an interesting plot line that sort of carries us through this book. This book predominantly centers our two main characters, Sadie and Sam, two incredibly close friends that we first meet in their early childhood, and they form a really deep relationship over their love of video games. Throughout the course of the story, we follow Sadie and Sam as they go to college, as they begin their professional career together as partners, as they actually begin to develop their own games that slowly and then very quickly kind of take over the world in popularity. Structurally, this book is told in such an interesting way, and it's honestly why I feel like the story delivered so strongly for me, because you're reading this book alternatively between their two different perspectives, but you're also following them in different chapters of their life. First, you're introduced to them as children when their passions were kind of sparked, as this really fundamental childhood friendship was formed. You see them again as young adults in college as they begin to work together as partners and kind of creating this brainchild of theirs, and then fast forward, you see them more so in their professional lives. But alternating in between not only their perspectives, you also get snippets of the future that kind of juxtapose the scene that you just read, because you're reading from their point of view and their real raw emotions in the moment, but then you might have a snippet of an interview kind of reflecting back on this moment like 30 years in the future. And I think just provides a really interesting detail that Gabrielle Zevin wove into this story. I really liked this book. I think the video game concept was fascinating. I am a video game lover myself, but I feel like even if you don't love games, you will appreciate just the genius and the passion that both of these characters have for this topic, because you see not only the complex technical side, as both of our main characters are incredibly smart, but you also see the artistic side as well, the desire for expression, the desire for wanting to create something that will make people feel like they belong or will capture their heart and their attention. And that was very much part of this book too. The heart of the story though is definitely Sam and Sadie's relationship, which was just a really fascinating friendship to read. Not only watching it evolve and change throughout the course of the story, but also just understanding how dynamic this friendship is. It's interesting to have a male-female relationship front and center that's friendship, and it was intimate, it was fascinating. They really felt like extensions of the other. They understood each other like no one else could. They were also very, very different, and in some ways, as close as they are, they're also not close at all in other aspects, emotionally speaking. I don't know, I just really liked this book. It was very character focused, very fascinating, central topic. It really delivered for me. Love stories that take place over many years of time, and this also had that. It was just gripping, honestly, from page one. I read it in 2 days. The next book I'm going to recommend is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This book I felt like was everywhere for a moment. This is a cozy romance, fae-centered story, and the reason why I kind of got a lot of traction online is because a lot of people compared it to Howl's Moving Castle. I will say before I dive into the synopsis itself, this does have Howl vibes. I wouldn't say the story is Howl's Moving Castle, but the main male love interest definitely gives off chaotic, beautiful Howl vibes. So if that interests you, you might want to consider this. But this story follows our main character, Emily Wilde, and she is kind of an eccentric, curmudgeonly professor-like character. She's also committed the majority of her life to studying fae, and she is considered one of the world's topmost experts on the topic of fae, and she's also been working on this encyclopedia which catalogs all the different types of fae, their stories. You get the idea. At the beginning of this book, she's nearing the end of this research project, and she's visiting one last town to try to get a few more stories to wrap up her encyclopedia. area. But when she arrives in town, she's kind of having a hard time getting the village to warm up to her. It's this cold and very desolate place, and she's especially annoyed when her co-worker Wendell arrives, who is incredibly charismatic and very quickly wins everyone over. From there, they begin to work together, and also a Fae mystery begins to capture the town too. And I have to say, this book was just utterly delightful. It's actually book one to a series, and I just feel like it had a lot of really positive things going for it. First off, if you love cozy, cutesy romance with a low spice, this is a great book to pick up. Emily Wilde's and Wembley's relationship was just cute and charming, and kind of seeing it develop throughout the course of this novel was really, really delightful. Two, I loved the Fae setting. I was kind of expecting the fantasy Fae element to take a backseat to the romance in this book, but I could not be more wrong. There were so many really interesting Fae stories, all the lore, the setting of the Fae world that's definitely a part of this book was just really well crafted and clearly very researched by the author when writing the story. I also just enjoyed the contrast of Emily and Wendell's character. One is sunshine, one is more grumpy, and I also really appreciated that Emily never really lost her passion or her reason for traveling to this place at all throughout the course of the story. I felt like it balanced characters, romance, fantasy so well, and it was just a charming, cozy read. Like, to me, it just delivered exactly what I wanted it to, and that was very satisfying. And again, it does have some Howl's Moving Castle vibes, which is also a win in my book. Next up, I had to mention an older fave, but still a fave nonetheless, and that is the Green Bone Saga series by Fonda Lee. Listen, I can't let too much time pass before I talk about Jade City on my channel. It's just too good of a series to let it kind of fade into the backdrop. I also feel like this series is super popular and possibly sitting on a lot of y'all's shelves, but maybe you haven't picked it up yet. So this is my call to action to give this series a try, because wow, from a contemporary urban fantasy point of view, this book is so good, absolutely high octane, so entertaining, and has a great cast of characters too. But this book is set on the island of Kekon, and this geographical location is special for a few reasons, one of them being the power of jade. Jade is only found in this area, and there's also only certain people in the area that's able to harness the power of jade itself, which basically makes you faster, stronger, better than like a normal human. Given that this resource is very, very important, the other thing that has resulted on the island of Kekon is crime families. Specifically, there are two primary crime families that not only controls the production of jade, but also the government and all different types of things in the area. They've been kind of in a cold war for quite a few years now, but it's beginning to heat up again in book one. Throughout the series, you're reading from a variety of perspectives from one of these crime families, and it's just so good. You have family drama, you have a crime family element, there's so much action and just like backstabbing, but it's also an incredibly dynamic series. On the one hand, we have politics and economics and business expansion, and then on the other hand, we have back alley fights and the control of territory on the ground. It's such an interesting mix of characters and concepts, and it's absolutely gripping. I love this trilogy. It's 100% worth the hype then. It's 100% worth the hype now. You gotta read it if you haven't. The next book I'm gonna recommend is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is basically my PSA to myself, but also to y'all. If you haven't read Octavia E. Butler before, you gotta. I need to read more books by her, and I have more books of hers on my shelf, but the book I have read is this book, and it absolutely knocked my socks off and kind of like ruined my life at the same time. It was such a powerful work of fiction that almost eerily feels like nonfiction, which is why I also feel like everyone's got to read it. And this book is set in America in the early 2020s, where a climate crisis led to the collapse of society itself in America. Particularly, this is actually set in California. We follow our main character, Lauren. Lauren lives in this sort of gated, protected community with her family as well as other families, and they all kind of help each other survive. Lauren's father is a particularly important person in this community, as he's also a preacher. Lauren herself also has a secret, and that is that she has hyperempathy, meaning if someone is hurt around her, she herself feels it. And obviously, in a world where any weakness can lead to death, she has to keep this secret to herself. At the beginning of this book, Lauren also begins to have this sense that if the community doesn't begin to evolve and change and adapt to the new world that they're now existing in, something terrible could happen. Lauren herself begins to contemplate philosophy, religion, and also what is the next steps for the world itself. This book structurally is written in such a fascinating way, and that is, it reads like Lauren's diary. We're kind of jumping from day to day, her different musings, her interpretations, the life events that absolutely shakes her and her family's life to the core. And you also follow Lauren as she begins a journey physically and also spiritually as she begins to try to unpack and figure out where she also feels like the world needs to go to next, and kind of shed the past, as the world can never really go backwards, if that makes sense. This book is just extraordinary for so many different reasons. It feels real and horrifying and such a true possibility, but at the same time, it also feels hopeful, which I think as a combination is such a difficult thing to achieve, and Octavia E. Butler does it, and does it perfectly. This is one of the best books I've ever read. It's taught in school for a reason. You gotta check it out if you haven't read it. The next book I'm gonna talk about is a newer release, and that is Truss of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. It's the first of the secret projects that Brandon Sanderson is releasing throughout the course of this year, and truth be told, I was obviously so excited about these secret projects. I'm a big Brandon Sanderson fan, but also in the back of my mind, I was thinking to myself, well, he wrote 4 books, additional books. How good could they be? Like, are they just going to be novellas? Are they just going to be kind of throwaway stories? I wanted them to be fantastic. I, of course, wanted to love them. I went in with really high expectations, but I couldn't help but to have a little bit of doubt at the back of my mind. And the first book was an absolute knockout, and actually might be one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson books he's ever released. Just as a standalone, it was delightful, it was charming, and it was so much fun to see Brandon Sanderson write with such whimsy. Truss is Brandon Sanderson's answer to the Princess Bride, but instead having Buttercup kind of be the main character of the story. But this story follows our main character Truss, and Truss lives on an island where none of the residents are allowed to leave. She's also surrounded by something called the Emerald Sea. On Truss's world, the sea is not comprised of water, but instead something called spores, and spores interact with water and kind of result in spontaneous creation, if you will. Different spores have different reactions, and obviously moving across spores can be very, very dangerous. At the beginning of this book, Truss is honestly happy with her life. She loves her job, she loves her family, she also has someone on the island she loves very much. They get sent away and sent to a very dangerous place. It's up to Truss to set out on an adventure in hopes of trying to save them. And so begins a journey, an adventure. We follow Truss as she crosses the Emerald Sea, as she makes new friends, as she takes on new challenges, as she encounters and overcomes all of these obstacles, and it was just so good. I loved it. I also am such a sucker for a fairy tale-esque story, and this is that in spades. Structurally, this book is also written in a way that it's told to us. We have a narrator who was there and experienced the story, so I feel like it added a lot of flair. They often broke the fourth wall, and they're also a well-known character to us in the Cosmere, which just made it extra fun and special. But this book was just so much fun, and as I said, truly the most whimsical book I've read from Brandon Sanderson, and I loved it. It was just everything I could have wanted, and I'm so happy I now have a Brandon Sanderson fairy tale on my shelf. And I also feel like if you've never read a Brandon Sanderson book, you can 100% start here. Yes, there are some Cosmere references, but it will not detract from your reading experience if you don't 100% get every single Easter egg. There's no spoilers to anything else really at all. It's just a delightful good time. The next book I feel like is super popular, but 100% worth all the hype it receives, is Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell. I loved this book. I was so charmed by this book, and I also listened to the audiobook, which was incredibly just well done. And in some ways, I would actually say I recommend listening to it on audio because it was just so fantastic and captured the spirit of the story so well. But this is a story following Shakespeare and his family. But the funny thing about this book is that Shakespeare is never named as such. It's really about any particular family at any particular time and the emotions and the grief that they all go through. But this book is set in England in 1580. And in this story, we follow a young Shakespeare, or a young Latin tutor, as he falls in love with a slightly older, very eccentric woman named Agnes. You see them get married, you see them move into a home together, and you see them begin to have a family. You meet all of their children, you follow different chapters of their life in this beautifully crafted story. You also see as the Black Death knocks on this family's door and changes their life forever. This book is beautiful, it's heartbreaking, it's just so wonderfully written. The writing style of this just absolutely hits home. It's kind of a collection of different vignettes. You read the book from lots of different characters. I would say in a lot of ways Agnes is the main character, but I just feel like Maggie O'Farrell has this talent to humanizing some of the most well-known figures in history and creating a story that's not about them or their fame in any way, shape, or form, but really stripping them down to the fundamental things that everyone in a lot of ways can relate to or experience or has experienced, which I think is what makes this book so beautiful too. It has a touch of magic, it has a touch of whimsy, but really at the heart of it, it's full of love and family and grief, and it was just exceptionally done. And the last book I'm going to recommend is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, one of the best historical fantasy books I have read in quite some time. The sequel also comes out this year, so a perfect time to read this and then be really prepared to marathon the whole thing, because the sequel is obviously going to be fantastic too, and I cannot wait. This book is often described as Mulan meets the Song of Achilles. I actually feel like that's a rather apt description for the overall vibe of this book. This book opens in 1345 and is set in China. And at this time, China is controlled by the outside Mongol rule. And we follow our main character Zhu, who at the start of the story is a young girl growing up in a very poor peasant family. And as the daughter of the family, she is not treated anywhere near the same as her older brother. And at the beginning of this book, her family travels to a fortune teller where her brother is told that he is going to have a great fate. Unfortunately, though, shortly after, a famine strikes the village and everyone in Zhu's family dies but her. So she decides to take on the mantle of her brother's fate, actually become him. From there, we follow Zhu as they begin their journey of education by living amongst monks. And we also follow Zhu as they become embroiled in rebellion. And we quickly see their rise to power. This book is a multi-POV historical fantasy tale that really leans on its historical influences, and I feel a very successful way. As I said, this book has multiple characters, and identity and queerness is very much a part of this book and explored in different facets through each of these different characters' perspectives. It's full of incredibly dynamic relationships, really gray morals, as well as a really dramatic and harrowing point in history. This book, honestly, in my opinion, just has so many fantastic elements to it that just makes it so entertaining. Such a great setting, such great characters, so many different topics explored, so many different angles. I just felt like it had so much to say, plus it had such a cool historical setting too. It was a 10 out of 10 for me. Alrighty guys, those are some popular books that I think are worth the hype. Please let me know down below some books you've read recently that are super popular that you loved, as I would love to know. And I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye.